Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Dennis. I'm the lead artist of Moz House. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Today's podcast guest is current March 2025 resident Megan Hicks. Megan is an archaeologist exploring community ecologies within colonial and capitalistic transformations. Her research in Iceland examines traditional farming, fishing, and hunting practices and their role in shifting political and market structures. In the northeastern United States, she focuses on 19th century Black enclaves, investigating land use and self-determination amid economic marginalization. She also collaborates with Native communities to protect heritage sites using excavation, zooarchaeology, and archival research. Megan emphasizes engaged archaeology, co-designing projects with descendant and host communities. As an educator, she teaches courses on colonialism, zooarchaeology, urban archaeology, and gender, and integrating student fieldwork into her research. Thank you to Hunter College for sponsoring Megan's residency. We hope to invite future faculty to attend the house program as well. Thank you, Megan, for joining the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me as a resident this week.
Absolutely, so exciting. When you applied to the residency, you said that you wanted to explore countermapping as a tool against disposition. Can you break down your role in countermapping and how it enters into your work, how you came up with it, and how it helps to reclaim histories?
I would say first off that countermapping has been used as a concept and a praxis for a long time, way before me just trying it out. And countermapping as an idea has developed in communities, most importantly. One example is that the Black Panthers used countermapping to understand their urban social environment. Countermapping can probably be most simply defined as mapping that emphasizes community experiences or individual experiences and doesn't necessarily rely on state narratives. I am interested in how countermapping kind of fits in to my practices as a researcher, especially in contexts where I'm engaging with communities, trying to strengthen or reinforce their relationships to their local landscapes, whether urban or non-urban, relationships with the land, for example. And I think countermapping can be a really powerful voice and tool for communities. The great thing about countermapping is that it can be very formal. You can use software to countermap, or you can use kind of formal mapping conventions, but countermapping can be really informal, where you can draw a picture or build a model however you want to out of any material. So I think it's a very cool practice for that reason. Where it has come into my work is in collaboration with Indigenous communities. Occasionally I'll collaborate by request with Indigenous communities around the issue of land protection. In one instance, recently, for example, I worked with a great team of people, including my colleague Chris Matthews, Montclair University, and my colleague Eric Johnson, who at the time was at Brown University. And we worked with the Ramapo in northern New Jersey to map a sensitive area in the landscape that was being run and protected by a nature conservancy, but it was in danger of being in the town, or the county was looking at repurposing the land and allowing people to use it as a dump. However, this area of land was known to have remnants and evidence of past occupation by Indigenous communities. With the guidance of the Ramapo Turtle Clan, Chief Vincent Mann, and the clan's medicine woman, Michaeline Pacaro, we mapped the area with their advice on what they knew about. We ended up mapping a lot of large stone structures that were beautiful and important structures that should be preserved and not destroyed by turning the land into a dump. We made this report available to state level authorities, the State Historic Preservation Office. How this exemplifies counter mapping is really mapping from the perspective of the Ramapo community. All maps have an agenda and make an argument. Our map was making an argument where perhaps county level maps might just map the empty land with no indication of the people who have lived there and the relationship with that land. We were mapping people back into the relationship with the landscape and, understanding that that landscape has a long history of being loved and of mutual belonging with the people who've been there for a very long time. You can see how this is a really clear example of mapping, not relying on state narrative of this place as an empty land, but on community narratives of deep relationship through time.
And yeah, I love how you have your mapping, which can sometimes be colonial and erasure, but then the way that you use it is you bring people and humanity back to it.
Yeah, and also here you can really see how this tool can be applied by communities. It can be applied in the context of activism, and I think gets so much important definition from there, and then it can be applied by academics in collaboration with communities and in the context of an activist approach or a direct approach to solving a problem. So I love that the tool or the technique or this methodology really can be used by anybody.
Thank you for that. And
yeah.
I also wanted to ask, in terms of what type of material you're working with, you have a book in progress titled Exposing Erasure, Archaeologies of Marginalization and Resilience in the Northeast, which has multiple key themes and topics, but one focuses on the Dunderhook community.
Yes, Dunkerhook.
An emancipated Black settlement in New Jersey. Can you talk about what made you focus on this history and what kind of archaeological evidence you're bringing to make it come to life?
Absolutely. I wonder where I should start. First of all, I would say that for a long time, I've been building my skills in environmental archaeology and seeing environmental archaeology as a way to understand how communities have lived in relation with their landscapes for a very long time. I have, for the past few years, been thinking mostly about quite recent colonial histories in the past 500 years. That's sort of my main focus. And as I've been building up my toolkit, environmental archaeology, and especially zooarchaeology, I've been thinking it would be important to apply this approach to setting out a framework for thinking about Black communities and environments. I was inspired by work on Black communities immediately post-emancipation in the New York City area, because that's where I'm based and work at Hunter College. I was thinking a lot about Weeksville and Seneca Village. There is some writing and there's work in progress, and there are reports and there's writing about how these communities use their landscape. There are other communities like Sandy Ground, and there's writing on that community. I'm really interested in zooming out a bit and looking at the 1800s as this important time period where Black people are in various stages of emancipation. There's gradual emancipation being enacted in the early 1800s. And then in New Jersey, there's not formal, complete emancipation until the conclusion of the Civil War. So there are Black communities forming, and people are immediately situating themselves in the landscape. Some communities are able to buy land. And then other communities are tenants. Communities like Little Africa probably have very little land that they're using, probably none, because Little Africa was characterized by apartment buildings, the tenements. So this issue of land is really important, and you can see how in all of these different cases, the amount of land that a community has immediately correlates to their well-being and their ability to create some self-sufficiency in this broader political landscape in which they're marginalized. There are episodes of direct violence happening, like the draft riots. And so with the Dunkerhook project, this presented an opportunity for me to contribute to stories like that. The Dunkerhook community is located in Bergen County in northern New Jersey, was mostly a tenant community, living on the margins of former plantations where most likely many were enslaved, and it forms around the 1830s. There are also other communities that we should mention, I think, free communities in New Jersey, including a community that has been called Skunk Hollow, but I believe it has another preferred name, which is perhaps Under the Mountain or On the Mountain, which is right on the border of New Jersey, New York, in the Palisades. And there's another community called Timbuktu. So there are a lot of free communities forming in New Jersey as well.
That's awesome. I was debating asking you about Timbuktu because we had another artist, Daisha Devin Harris, here at Ma's house. I think there's another community in upstate New York with that same name. Mm-hmm. But of course, as she explains it, it was once thriving, and then just because of how remote it was and how it's hard to get resources, sometimes those places kind of disperse or people find different places to live. I wanted to just ask, because we also have like communities that were free after enslavement. Where do you even start in terms of firsthand research or prime source material?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you asked this because I wanted a chance to talk about how the project was initiated. The archaeological survey itself was initiated by my colleagues who I'm collaborating with, Chris Matthews at Montclair and Eric Johnson, who at the time was at Harvard. Some people listening may know Chris Matthews' work because he has a long history of contributing to and building histories of erased or displaced Black communities on Long Island, northern New Jersey, and the Northeast in general. And that is among the core missions of his work. And Eric Johnson has been doing some very interesting work on wampum workshops in northern New Jersey. They initially centered on the Dunkerhook community as a promising place to pursue some work that they had underway. In 2021, after the pandemic eased up a little bit, we had the opportunity to bring students there and run a field school. So we carried out the excavation, but another mission was to educate the next generation of student archaeologists. The work took shape in that way. One of the first stages in an archaeological project, sometimes in commercial archaeology, it's called phase one, is essentially using maps and historical documents to understand where a settlement, household, or any kind of archaeological feature, where it was or where it may be still perhaps in ruins or underground. And so in planning the research, the first stage is archival research and historical research, consulting the paper archive first.
That's awesome. And I think the other day you were saying during these phases, sometimes you can actually be on site for 2 weeks and then have like a year's worth of documents to organize.
Yeah, and not just documents, but actual materials that you excavate. So documentary research is an important phase of the research. And then after excavation, we end up having a lot of carefully cataloged artifacts. They're organized in terms of the layer in which they were excavated. They're all kept in association with that layer, either bagged, boxed, or carefully packaged with labeling that brings them back to the layer that they're from. And then you have to begin analysis of all of those materials. We were excavating one household, the Bennett household, at 263 Dunkerhook Road. We had an assemblage of household remains, household refuse, including everyday objects. The benefit of excavating household refuse piles is that you really end up finding the objects that people were interacting with every day. And so you start to build a sense of their everyday life, not just the things that we might find to be important in terms of capital H history, like perhaps the things that end up in somebody's obituary, like what their job was or who their family was. These things are findable in other types of archives, but we tend to get down to the finer details of everyday life through looking at household artifacts. The subset of materials that I've been looking at are the archaeofaunal remains, which means the animal bones from the site. What I'm attempting to understand is how people may have kept animals, domesticated livestock, how people may have fished, and how people may have used bird species or poultry at the site. I am looking to this to understand how this reveals their larger, broader engagements with the landscape. For example, did they have pasture? Did they have land that they could use? Or did they just have small parcels and were using them kind of maximally as best as they could? Were they hunting? Were they using the broader landscape? Or were they kind of hemmed in by the conditions of racial capitalism, which during this century has a pattern of prohibiting Black communities from really fully using the landscape or accessing the landscape as much as the wealthier, affluent white communities nearby.
That's incredible. And you have connections all the way back to 2019 and even earlier to Shinnecock. You were one of the maybe a few dozen who actually came out, camped at the Shinnecock monuments during the construction on Montauk Highway. You were there in protest of New York State's economic development attack on Shinnecock and how the Department of Transportation didn't want those built. And the governor's office didn't want them built. So you came out for that. That's a whole thing we could also talk about.
Yes, I would love to.
Well, let's start there. I think it's interesting because when we think of academics, when we think of teachers, they're sometimes undervalued. And because of the politics, it's always a risk when you do anything aside from teaching. So I wonder what it was about the Shinnecock monuments that made you want to come out, actually camp, stay overnight, and join that community.
That's a great question. I think I have to dig a bit deeper into my past to answer that question. And I think it comes down to our relationships with land, right? Across different communities. In the colonial context of the Americas, different communities who are racialized in different ways have different relationships with the land as a result of this. In some sense, I like to think about and focus my activism or my academic work on it. It all comes back to that issue in a sense. I think I, myself and many other people, received a deep education during Standing Rock, right? And seeing how industry and sort of a hegemonic political and industrial approach to the land was really harming Indigenous communities. And I think that combined with my understanding, being an Afro-descendant person in America, my understanding of histories of Black well-being and our relationship with the land has made me understand the importance of supporting Indigenous struggles to protect Indigenous and Native relationships to the land. So as somebody who lives in a place characterized by settler colonialism, I want to make sure that I am supporting people who are struggling against those conditions. And that manifests in a lot of different ways, right? Not every struggle is the same. The Montauk Highway isn't exactly the same as Standing Rock, but there are important similarities. I have participated in other situations and offered support in which communities are protecting their lands, sometimes just in the form of logistical support or sometimes in the form of expertise from my discipline. So for me, participating in the encampment, I also continued to receive a lot of education. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have participated and received an education and understood, I hope, in a deep way, the particular challenges that people at Shinnecock are working in the context of or against. I was also very grateful to have that opportunity and that invitation to be there. I would like to continue that type of work and experience into the future, of course.
Thank you for answering that. Just to give some context, we're doing the podcast very early, no preparation or no questions in advance. And then I'm just asking you casually, like, do you remember what happened 6 years ago?
I actually do remember it crystal clear and every day of it, because it was great to be here and meet so many people in the community, connect with elders and learn from them. Something that I've noticed since then is how there is this really cool generation of young people right now doing so much in the community with so much expertise and vision, and you're one of them. Grateful to know you too.
That was actually my next question, because you've been here for about a week at Ma's house, and we drove to a couple of local sites for my On This Site project, which maps Native presence here on Long Island, New York. I wanted to ask, how did you come across the On This Site project? And it is definitely a work in progress, even though it started in 2016. There's like so much content. There's so much ways to present it. But I wonder, through your lens and expertise as a archaeologist and someone who uses counter mapping, how you would pursue presenting that project in terms of public communities in general, classrooms, Shinnecock community. You probably have so many ways that you engage your students in terms of mapping in Native histories as well.
I think I first learned about your project around 2019 or 2020. Sometime between 2019 and 2021, I ended up visiting you here in the context of a visit to Shinnecock territory. What year did we figure out that was? You were in the process of renovating Ma's house, so I was able to visit you, saw Ma's house down to the studs, and heard about your vision for Ma's house. And then I think through following you on social media and following Ma's house as well, I learned about your project On This Site. So it was through social media that I learned about it. It was incredible to go through your social media posts. They worked as a portal into important parts of the website that you wanted to share. It was great discovering your long-term work on that, because it's a fantastic example of counter mapping. Counter mapping is not always public, but the fact that you're making this a public educational resource for anyone who would like to access it is really doing so many things. A better understanding of Long Island history, Native presence in Long Island, making available archives that are very difficult to access for your everyday person, because most people just simply don't think about these things. Making an appointment to view an archive is also just a whole process, right? Mm-hmm. I have so much admiration for this project, and I love sharing it with my students, because I think one of the most important things they can learn from it is also just the personal initiative that you've taken with the project. You decided you were going to do the project and you did it, right? And it's a big project and it's important to a lot of people. It's really impacting what a lot of different kinds of people can access from a lot of different backgrounds. And I think that's what, for me, is important to share, in my pedagogy, is that if we take the initiative, if we really understand our personal responsibility, our personal motivations, and take the initiative to create projects like this, we can each, we can affect a lot of change.
All right, well, thank you for that. And I think you're also revealing like how great of a teacher you are and how your students have to come to office hours more.
Thank you.
I did want to quickly mention that 2 days ago on Friday, you led our weekly evening workshop on counter mapping, which was really incredible what everyone came up with. You had options for collage, sculptural mapping. You also had leather, which a lot of people delved into. So I think that was really incredible. But I think we'll post some of that on our social media so people have an impression of what you led and how interactive it was. But I do want to ask you, relating to the On the Site project, going back to that real quick, you have this concept of sedimentation and landslide as a metaphor for the displacement of Black diaspora. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about that because if anyone has been to Long Island, most of our listeners live here. Mm-hmm. We all know it's so flat. And for Shinnecock people, our land that we're trying to regain is the Shinnecock Hills. It's elevated. Our sacred sites are on hilltops. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe this concept that you're developing, or maybe someone else spoke about it and you're adding to it. Do you just want to talk a little bit about this really interesting concept?
Of course. So I would say, first of all, that I encountered this idea of sedimentation in the work of Black feminist thinkers first. So people like Saidiya Hartman and then Tiffany Lethabo King. Saidiya Hartman, for example, uses this metaphor of sedimentation, thinking about how relationships can be shifted and fall into place. And Tiffany Lethabo King uses a metaphor of shoaling to think about movement and resistance. So thinking about a shoal, which is like an underwater land formation, and how this impacts the current, which is the current is sort of the broader social condition, and the shoal is a place where the broader social condition meets resistance. And so, yeah, I just wanted to shout out thinkers like that who've actually really been developing the idea. Wrote about that idea in a very short piece that was commissioned by a scholar who's a friend of mine named A.K. Burns. And for me, I felt a lot of connection to that as an archaeologist, just because we actually deal with soil, at our fingertips, and we're sometimes working and immersed in soil for weeks at a time. And, thinking about the process of soil formation, soils can form through broader environmental conditions like erosion and wind and the movement of water. And soils can form because of very conscious cultural contribution. And in those cases, sometimes the ways that soils are formed can really sustain us. And then referencing something that Du Bois noticed, that when social conditions are under pressure, sometimes that's very evident in the wasting of the soil as well. So there's just this intimate connection between social relationships and soil. And you asked me a question about how that perhaps relates to Shinnecock.
Oh, sure. You also wrote a little bit about the concepts of, in terms of archaeological work, grounding within the z-axis, or instead of just like the distance from us, the depth between us, I believe. So I was really curious just about like how does movement of this elevation, how does focusing on elevation perhaps relate to what's going on here at Shinnecock in terms of like how we need to escape coastal erosion, sea level rise?
Great question. So when I wrote that essay, Grounding in the Z-Axis, I was trying to communicate this idea of soils being reflective of our broader social relationships. And so I was thinking about soils themselves and what they're made of, and our exchanges with soils in different, as we are engaged in different historical moments or different community histories. And I was thinking mostly about the subterranean. And I think what you bring up is so critical. If some listeners may not know that Shinnecock territory, as it is defined today by the state and the federal government, I suppose, is very close to sea level. However, the historical landscape of Shinnecock, from which people are marginalized right now by the forces of privatization and real estate development, that historical landscape is much larger and has places of higher elevation. And this is very important for community resilience in the context of climate change, in which we're going to see increased storminess and sea level rise. And so the community, as I'm sure you can elaborate on this in important ways, the community faces challenges in reclaiming some higher ground, hopefully. And I think that this is an important political project. And I think I would like to hear from you a little bit more, perhaps, about what I may not know about how that's taking shape.
It kind of feels like, well, I sometimes reveal to people that there's like a Shinnecock Facebook group, and we have like just like inner conversations about this occasionally, about like land back. developments in the news. It sometimes feels like a tug of war where it's just like something impending and terrible is coming, and then it gets reversed, or someone has like a conscience. So we, especially back in 2021, when we finally preserved Sugarloaf Hill, had a mansion that was built on it in the 1990s that was finally, after 30 years, purchased and demolished, and it's on its way back to becoming just like a natural site, hopefully preserved for future generations too. But that's something that we're trying to do for the entirety of perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 square acres of land. And I think it was just a lot of like, in our understanding of how we lost that land, it was a lot of deceit. It was a lot of just that simple concept of not knowing like what the concept of privatized land. I think, for example, even after this agreement was made, there were probably hundreds of Shinnecock people still living within the territory, not even knowing that we agreed to this arrangement. And so we're all hoping, kind of at the same time, like using so much effort, so many resources, so much grant writing to bring in sand to protect what we have. But at the same time, this is just land that's right across from the highway that would resolve so many problems in terms of elevating ourselves for resilience, having more room for like economic and just like residential purposes. So it's all these things that are just like, unfortunately, within reach. And at the same time, you have to always drive past it when you drive west towards New York City or like Riverhead or wherever you're going. And I think since that decision to preserve Sugarloaf Hill, we've just seen a exponential growth in terms of people building, people getting permits, people expanding like their house or their backyard. And so it's really something that I think at the end of each one of these questions, I'm always thinking like, all right, we have to bring you back to Shinnecock to get some funding to help do some more encampments.
Yes, absolutely. And I hope to be supportive of those efforts, certainly. And I just wanted to maybe go back to what you were saying about how whenever you drive west to New York City, which, people frequently do, or in the direction of New York City, you end up driving by these lands that are higher grounds, that are historical parts of, historical community landscapes that are being encroached upon. And so you're kind of are constantly seeing the development, like the real estate development happening there. And I imagine that is a reminder that this is sort of the moment to, make it happen. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And that, I just wanted to acknowledge that experience and also maybe speculate or wonder like what kinds of heritage documentation practices, like the ones that you're doing, and perhaps ones that could be contributed by a historic preservation office, could support the reclamation of those lands.
Definitely. Yeah. Something to pursue. I was going to ask you that in a little bit, and just on the topic of sedimentation and soil, and there's another thing that I believe you've either presented on or you wrote about, which is gardening and composting as future acts or ways to revisit stolen places and histories. I think this is such an interesting concept because the little bit of archaeology practice that I know is people go to a site, they dig, they kind of replace the soil, and then they try to make it seem like no one has ever been there.
Like nothing happened. Yeah.
But are you proposing like using these sites as like gardening, or maybe just places that have been stolen through time? Or
in that particular paragraph of that essay, I was actually just thinking about the gardening that people do every day. Yeah. And so not even as not expanding into any new area necessarily. I wasn't thinking about that, but I was just thinking about just gardening as a daily practice, as it is very humble and people don't think about it that much. But gardening makes you really engage with time, planning and time. Just in a similar way that like an official map or a counter map engages with place and time and planning, right? Like maps are arguments, maps are plans. And gardening makes you engage very closely with time, and it makes you plan the future and believe in the future. And it makes you, through different practices like composting or preservation of what comes out of the garden, you're really engaging with like a time span a few years into the future. And it's not an original statement to say that gardening is like a kind of futurism, but I was thinking about it that day when writing that piece. Yeah, it seemed important in some ways, but it's also sometimes a place where you encounter the past, because if you're gardening where someone else has gardened, you're going to find remnants of how they did it, how they treated the land. If you're turning over soils, you might find evidence of, they're improving the land, or find just remnants of, things they were doing and objects they had. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, sorry for putting it out of context a little bit.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah.
Suggest something.
It is, it's connected in kind of a slightly more abstract way, perhaps. Yeah.
I did want to go back to just like archaeology as like a profession. I believe that your philosophy is archaeology can be a language for reclamation. And here on Long Island, we spoke in this conversation itself that there's so much development going on. There's so much like land and soil being displaced. For example, people or archaeologists overseeing that work. At the same time, some of the archaeologists I met who do it professionally on Eastern Long Island, they're constantly like looking for work or stability or income. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like the need for archaeologists and like the viability of it as a profession, especially for like Shinnecock youth who are looking for something to do.
Absolutely. So archaeology is very complicated because there are many different kinds of archaeologists, especially if we're thinking about, through time. And I think archaeology early on was closely allied with antiquarianism, right? If we're thinking about the 1800s and the early 1900s, archaeology was closely aligned with antiquarianism and the beginnings of museums. And so archaeology was stealing and extracting a lot in many cases. In the early 1900s, people started to develop archaeology as a serious science further, a science that was asking questions about, what happened in this place and using systematic and shared methodologies for excavation. However, permission and permitting processes were not as robust as they are now. And I think there's still complexity into the present there's a sort of duality between academic archaeology, which is research focused, so asking research questions for the purpose of increasing our knowledge about a subject. And then there's commercial archaeology, which is a complex combination of sort of permitted, and it's a regulatory process to as part of a development or construction process, but it is also at the same time a research process. And I think one of the complexities of contract archaeology is that the budget that is very often supporting contract archaeology is the budget of the developer. And so sometimes contract archaeologists are needing to work for the timelines of the developer, and the priority is to make sure the landscape is empty so that development can proceed. And so for me, I think this is complex and problematic because in some cases where archaeologists might determine or create the condition that the landscape is empty, if you were to ask other communities, is the landscape empty? Not, right? It's full of history and heritage and connection and relationship and stories. And so I think this is something to note about archaeology, is that it's not one practice. It is, it's a tool, and different kinds of people can be holding the tool. And so it's important to discern what the motives and what the objectives are, right? And what the motives, the objectives, the economics, and the politics. And you also asked me about how could I make archaeology approachable for Shinnecock youth, and would I present it as a viable career option? Although I would say that archaeology is a challenging and complex practice, and it involves a lot of outdoor work and a lot of indoor work. So you have to have a lot of discipline to do it, I think. It involves committing to work that is challenging and complex. And I would say that it's so important that Shinnecock youth engage in archaeological practices. But I would not sugarcoat it and say that it's easy or that it's only fun. I think a lot of times when people share archaeology with youth, we want to brand it as fun. And I think it's more like a puzzle and a challenge. And I think that's the part of it that is engaging. It's not just fun. It is also fun because it's, great to work with teams of people. Sometimes, it's fantastic to work outdoors if you like that kind of thing. It's amazing to work with your hands. I just don't want to simplify it because I do believe it is also like a challenging puzzle, and then it's in this broader social context that is very complex. I would also say that, archaeology has a very interesting ambivalence for the general public, where there's tons of fantasy around what archaeology is. People immediately think of things that are so fascinating to them or exciting, like certain movies or, like adventure characters. But there's this ambivalence where, in terms of like the public knowledge about archaeology, people's minds go to those examples. And there's sort of a lack of knowledge about what archaeology is really about. And I think that's a challenge for archaeology. Because we deal with complex research questions, sometimes it's not that like telegenic or radiogenic or whatever. Like it's not that easy to share in a quick quip, and people, more and more people are orienting themselves to like faster, shorter information in visual, like video form or audio form. In social media. And so I think a challenge for archaeology kind of moving forward is to understand our pedagogical role and to really step into our pedagogical role, and really engage with, public communication in a way that we're really helping people to understand what we do.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. So I'm hoping that inspires the future generations, especially from Shinnecock.
Yeah, and I hope to actually come back and do more work around that and engage youth more. As I was saying to you before, I want to engage youth in archaeology and archaeological practice in a way that conveys how important it is and how it's a really stimulating challenge. And, without sugarcoating it, without just saying that it's like having fun outside or something.
Oh, definitely. Well, thank you for that. And so many things you're saying throughout the interview, I want to put on t-shirts and make merch out of.
Nice.
Like things that we all should just be thinking about constantly. Well, today is, sadly, your last day at Ma's house. You've been here for a week. I wonder if you could just briefly talk about how you shaped your time here.
Okay, yeah, great question. So when I was here, I mostly focused, I think in terms of time, I focused quite a lot on writing. So I'm finalizing the 2 chapters that we briefly discussed. This one chapter, which is an interview chapter with you about your project on this site. And the other chapter is an environmental archaeological chapter about the Dunkerhook community and how they use their landscapes. So it was amazing to have time and space to write in this environment. And I mostly worked on the Dunkerhook chapter because our chapter is pretty solid. I was grateful for the time that we took together to create photographs for your chapter. So for our listeners, we went out for half of a day and drove around in the landscape and I observed Jeremy kind of doing his work, visiting places and collecting images of places that are important to Native histories on Long Island. And so those will be, I think, some good materials to include with your chapter. As you mentioned, on Friday, I led a counter mapping workshop, and I wanted to do this hands-on workshop about counter mapping because I think it's such an engaging and wonderful tool that is part of archaeology but can be a part of everyday practice. And it relates in this way to what I am doing with the book chapters, because both book chapters are kind of mapping communities back into their landscapes. So that was the exciting kind of connection point for me between the writing process. So I think the other fantastic things about being here have just been connecting with your community here. So when you had the book club night and we, had a game night, that was fantastic just to meet people here. Meeting people during the workshop was fantastic. Going to the opening in Sag Harbor was great to see kind of like the broader community and how you are collaborating in other spaces and doing curatorial projects. So I think just being able to weave myself in for a moment, for a week in the community here and see what everyone is up to has been really educational and really valuable.
That's so special that you've had a great time and you always invited it back.
Yeah, and actually I don't want to leave out meeting Prince, who was the other resident who overlapped with me here. It was amazing meeting Prince and hearing about his work, and we even had a great adventure where we popped out to the beach one day for a few minutes. So it's been great just connecting with people.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. You'll have to keep in touch and share your future ideas and collaborations. Speaking of which, I just wanted to end on, we always ask residents like what's coming next. I know that you have the Exposing Erasure book that you're working on coming out soon. Does that have a publication date that we can go out and purchase it?
Oh, good question. So I am co-editing that book. I'm co-editing it with Will Williams, who is a grad student at the CUNY Grad Center, and with Chris Matthews at Montclair. And we are in the process of assembling chapters right now. So we are calling our chapters in from our contributors. We'll probably have all of them in, I think, if we're lucky, by the end of the month. And from there, we will be moving the project forward. And I think book projects always take a little longer than academic book projects, perhaps take a bit longer than we would hope. But I would hope that it's complete next year. That would be incredible. And so, I'm crossing my fingers and I'm going to do everything I can to make that the case. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. We'll definitely get a copy for the Moss House Library. So looking forward to it.
Fantastic.
But yeah, thank you, Megan, so much for participating in the residency, for your time on the podcast. And
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thanks for being here. It's been great.